Right, so Israel's biggest boogeyman, the man they feared more than anyone else, Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, is dead. And we're told this is a great victory. That we should not mourn this man, where in Israel they broke out into spontaneous celebration. But their cheers ought to be more muted, quite frankly. And for Western leaders telling us what good news this is, that might be what they're saying on the face of it at least, but behind closed doors, this course of events has both blindsided them and put them in an extremely difficult situation. Where they now see Hamas as finished, Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip crushed, it presents them with a massive Benjamin Netanyahu-shaped problem. This was supposed to be the endgame for Israel going into Gaza after the night of October 7th, after all. This was the basis for Western Zionists to support Israel's military action against people they already oppress, disgusting the general public from the off around the world and sending polling figures and support for various governments, not least ours here in the UK, tumbling. Both the Tories of Rishi Sunak before and Keir Starmer now. This should now be over then. All the warfare should end. That is what our leaders told us would happen. Except they've given Netanyahu too much free rein for too long, and he's not even going to pause for breath now. Good luck justifying support for that going forwards. Right, so Yahya Sinwar, leader of Hamas, the sole leader of Hamas since Israel assassinated his co-leader and leader of the ceasefire talks and negotiations on behalf of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran back in July, which of course prompted that most recent retaliation by Iran, of course, that military strike they conducted, has been killed in Rafah after being accidentally discovered by a routine Israeli patrol. Such, it seems, is Israel's fear of this man that they apparently turned a tank on him just to make sure they got him. This was supposed to be the end of the warfare in the region now, though, wasn't it? Hamas seemingly crushed. But it won't be. If anything, this course of action will just harden the resolve of those left. The IDF soldiers who happened upon Sinwar probably couldn't believe their luck. Armed as they were against him, wounded, he was there wearing a keffiyeh with nothing more than a stick to defend himself, apparently. He threw it at a drone in one last act of defiance before he was finished off by the IDF. Resistance to the very end is the message that has sent out. The images of his body lying in a partially demolished house as Israel basically chose to take him out rather than arrest him, as such a situation would surely demand, has obviously resonated. It is therefore a political headache for Benjamin Netanyahu that this is how it went down, that these are the images the world has seen. He would, I'm sure, have much preferred to have found Sinwar cowering behind Israeli refugees being used as human shields, but nothing of the sort was true, and they can't even spin as much of a narrative now as no doubt they would have done if those images hadn't gone out. Israel would have preferred anything, frankly, than the manner by which Sinwar went down to become public knowledge, because just as it was no more true that Hamas were using Israeli refugees as human shields, it was also not true that Hamas's leaders were hiding in tunnels, which was the justification for why so many buildings in Gaza were levelled by the IDF. The hospitals, the schools, the churches, the mosques. Because they were where Hamas were hiding, apparently. These were their bases, we were told. Sinwar went down in the one way Israel has determined none of the Hamas leaders ever did. Fighting. As much as people can rightfully question at times the motives and methods of Hamas committing condemnable acts in and of themselves, the very seizure of hostages on October 7th, a war crime as an obvious, for instance, and an overly promoted one by the mainstream media, biased as they have been, but the disproportionate response by Israel that they don't talk about so much opened the eyes of the world to the reality of Israeli occupation. It hasn't been going on since October 7th. It has been going on for decades, right back to the Nakba of 1948, to the Six-Day War of 1967, which has had Palestine held under Israeli occupation ever since. For all the stories will have been told about Sinwar, he was shaped by all of that, as so many Palestinians have been. He was 5 years old when the Israeli occupation began in 1967. He's known nothing else really, like so many. 3 generations of Palestinians who have never been free of Israeli control. So if you wonder why they resist to the lengths, whether you agree with them or not, that they go to, you really shouldn't if you've been paying attention to the last year of atrocity and realise it's been going on for far, far longer than that. And if you're also wondering why so many are grieving Sinwar's death, why so many have sung his praises, he was the figurehead for resisting all of that. Can you imagine grieving any of our leaders the way Sinwar's loss is being mourned? That in and of itself should be very telling of what he meant to people living under occupation. And whilst Israel may jeer at it and celebrate his death instead, when you realise Sinwar was a symbol for opposing that, as all of us are opposing Israeli atrocity, Unless you are the most hardened and far gone of Zionists, of course. You can kind of put yourself in the mindset many Palestinians will have right now. But this is supposed to now be the end, isn't it, right? Israel's won. It's achieved what it set out to do, hasn't it? Hamas's leaders are all gone. Time to pack up and go home. This is what we were told would happen, wasn't it? Well, such is the problem for the West now, as this is how they sold their support for Israel to us, the public, long before we really saw the reality of the genocide. The first genocide in history to be played out in real time before all of our eyes via our computers and our laptops and our mobile devices, as social media all of a sudden woke an awful lot of people around the world up to how insulated and protected from such images we have been by our establishment mainstream media. Now they have to justify things not ending, because Benjamin Netanyahu has no intention of stopping now. Nothing has changed at all for him. His job, his post that he covets above all else, still depends on war carrying on, because the likes of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich demand it. The hard right of his own government. Smotrich wants greater Israel now. Conquest all the way to Damascus, taking up much of Syria, taking in Jordan, Lebanon, the West Bank as well, parts of Turkey even. There's no sign of Israel stopping now. All of that land theirs by divine right in their fevered minds. The opportunity the Hamas attack of October 7th has offered such hardline, far-right politicians is now too much of an opportunity to miss. And they'll collapse Netanyahu's government and put him in the arms of the courts before they let him stop now. Not that I personally think Netanyahu wants to stop anyway. Lebanon is now in his sights for conquest. Iran is a war in the making, are they not? But for Western leaders, well, this outcome has been a nightmare. Sinwar's death heralds them being put in a position where their pro-Israel lobbyist backers and donors will not accept a cessation of the support for Israel continuing its warfare. But support for what is going to happen next will be politicians breaking their word on when this would all end to their own people. Already Kamala Harris's unequivocal support to carry on supporting Israel, not changing anything Joe Biden has done before, is catastrophically killing off her electoral chances amongst Muslim demographics who typically back the Democrats, offering an opportunity for Donald Trump to pull off a victory, not by backing him, but by staying home instead, not voting at all. Keir Starmer here in the UK has again raced to a podium to do a speech in light of an Israeli win, talking the usual sound bites of this death which should not be mourned, he said, along with calls for a ceasefire, humanitarian aid and a long-term plan for peace. It isn't going to come any more than it's going to come any time over the last year. And as much as this is political positioning on his part to look like he's saying the right things to us, the British public, who deplore him, most detested Prime Minister in British history as he is after 100 days in office, his support will continue for Israel, just as Netanyahu will continue to make war in the region. This all began with politicians. Sunak in our case at the time, but Starmer in agreement that there could be no peace in the region for as long as Hamas was capable of carrying out another October 7th style attack. Though of course the scale of that attack and what Hamas were accused of, it has since turned out to have been Israel too, in no small part due to carrying out Hannibal directives to kill their own people rather than let Hamas take them hostage. Still played down as those facts are though. By accidentally happening upon Sinwar in Rafah and taking him out though, Israel have achieved all of this now on the face of it. Hamas is leaderless, though the manner of Sinwar's death will have hardened resolve and people under occupation will always resist, as is their right, whether it be Hamas again or something else. A Palestinian state is essential to regional peace, but that requires taking Israel on now and forcing the issue with them. And that simply won't happen when so many Western politicians from the US, UK, Germany and across the EU are bought and paid for to the extent they have been by the Israel lobby. Yet these politicians have now done what they said they had set out to do. So continuing the war will be anathema to their own people, a broken promise to them. And so Sinwar's death boxes them in. They are required to end matters now. Their justification for continuing is over, and their support for Israel, yet won't be able to do so, and won't be able to justify that either when this was supposed to be all about Gaza, and yet conquering Lebanon next seems to be Israel's intended aim. Selling the point they need to support Israel to take Hezbollah on next doesn't quite have the same ring. When they were striking Israel in retaliation for their disproportionate invasion of Gaza, it was a retaliation. The support, therefore, isn't the same. The issue isn't the same, although the media will bend over backwards to paint it as such. and especially having seen the civilian casualty rate in Gaza as we all have. Nobody outside political circles as we are supports the IDF anymore, actually, in my view, than they would support terrorist acts or war crimes perpetrated by Hamas. And in another TV announcement, Netanyahu just turned the screws on his Western allies again. Honest to God, a guy who abuses his allies like Benjamin Netanyahu does, it makes them look all the wetter for still supporting him in the West. Because following Sinwar's death, of course, he was going to go on TV and shut down any notion of a ceasefire, sounding like a knockoff Bible seller being all wrath of God about it and saying, "We have demonstrated today that all those who try to harm us, this is what happens to them, and how the forces of good can always beat the forces of evil and darkness. The war is still ongoing and it's costly. We're still waging war, you better keep giving us more money to fund it," is the message to those who had been talking ceasefire instead, only for the genocidal maniac to pull the rug out from under them yet again. If Sinwar's death achieved anything, it was to harden the resolve of those resisting occupation. For the West, it damns them to either stop supporting Israel as promised now, or carry on unjustifiably with all the consequences that will bring for them at the ballot box. Where Western leaders now call for an end to the fighting, a ceasefire, it won't happen. Israel will continue, as Netanyahu has said, and they will continue to support him. It's only us living in the West that can make our leaders pay a price for putting Israel first. And we absolutely must do that if we're actually going to see a ceasefire. Because it is only by ending support for these Zionists without qualification in power, and ending the arms sales to Israel by association, ending Israel's ability to continue its genocide, that we will get anywhere close to a ceasefire. Our politicians will end up still telling us that Israel has a right to defend itself. But that's going to be an increasingly difficult sales pitch now, when they are clearly the instigators and the aggressors, and those they now attack, well, what of their right to defend themselves then? The Israel has a right to defend itself line is going to become a ball and chain around those who say it. That will also end up being Yahya Sinwar's legacy. Without support, without arms and military aid from the West, Israel is stuffed. Already its Iron Dome has been getting beaten more and more often, and the reason for that is it is now basically toast, to the point the US have had to step in, all but confirming the dome is done. Check out the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.